Hello YouTube, Bane666 here. Welcome to part 2 in this series in which I have a look at some second wave feminists, because they're just as toxic as the third wave. In fact, you could argue that they're even more toxic. And the reason why I'm looking at the second wave is because a lot of people, including anti-feminists, often say that feminism used to be about equality. And it's only with the third wave that that's changed. And that's simply not true. Feminism has always been about hating men and using women's rights as an excuse to blame everything on men and hate men. So in part 1 we looked at the Vancouver Rape Relief and Women's Shelter, a women's shelter which has been run for over 40 years now by second wavers. And in particular we are looking at an article written by one of its members in 1981. So right in the middle of the second wave of feminism. And in part 1 we explored how they thought that all men are potential rapists and all men are dangerous, but they still expected these same men to pay for their women's shelter. Yeah, that's what might be classed as entitled. So without any further delay, let's get stuck into it, because we do have a lot to get through in this particular episode.
Why a transition house? Women do 2/3 of the world's work, get 1/10 of the world's wages, and own 1/100th of the world's property.
Bullshit! Bullshit! Bullshit, 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 bullshit! Bullshit! Bullshit, 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 bullshit! 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 Bull, 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 bull. Shit, 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 shit. Bullshit, 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 bullshit.
So what I was trying to say there, and you may not have picked it up because I was trying to be very, very subtle, but what I was trying to say there was that these stats from the second wave feminists are absolute bullshit. I know, I was shocked too that second wave feminists would put out statistics which are absolute bullshit. I mean, this must be the first time that has ever happened. In fact, it's probably those pesky MRAs who have hacked their website and fiddled with the statistics just to make them look bad, because, you know, feminists would never tell lies, would they? But just to show you how wrong these stats are, I'm going to go through some parts of an article called The Zombie Statistics About Women's Share of Income and Poverty. Now, in case you don't know what a zombie statistic is, it's a bullshit statistic that will not die, that just keeps on getting repeated as if it's fact. And this is from the Washington Post.
The facts. Amazingly enough, most of this factoid, the 66% of work, 10% of income and 1% of property, dates back to some very fuzzy research from the late 1970s. Philip Cohen, a University of Maryland sociology professor, in 2011 traced it to a journal published by the International Labour Organization in 1978. Without any sourcing, the journal made this assertion: a world profile on women, using selected economic and social indicators, reveals that women constitute 1/2 of the world population and 1/3 of the official labor force, perform nearly 2/3 of work hours, but according to some estimates receive only 1/10 of the world income and possess less than 1/100th of world property. In 2007, Krishnojit Patel, an Indian lawyer who had worked for the United Nations for 25 years, wrote a book, Development Has a Woman's Face, Insights from Within the UN, in which she revealed she was responsible for the statistic. We've embedded a copy of the relevant text at the end of the column, but her explanation is maddeningly imprecise. She says she relied on various UN statistics, available global data, and fragmentary indicators at the time. As Cohen put it, the statistics turned out to be a guess based on an extrapolation wrapped round an estimate. Yet Ajit Patel even suggested that women might own much lower than 1% of world assets. Yet despite ample evidence that these are fishy figures, various organizations have willy-nilly cited them, often without attribution. And when attribution is provided, it usually leads back to a report by some UN agency, which then itself provided no attribution. It's like a constant feedback loop. This is a zombie fact, and it never dies, said Agnes Quij, Senior Research Fellow at the International Food Policy Research Institute.
I'll link to the complete article below if you want to go and read it. It's quite interesting, and it does also include the actual figures, which are not the ones quoted by the second wave feminists. But anyway, let's go back to that article by the second wavers and see what else they get wrong.
2/3 of the people on welfare are single mothers. They live 8.6% below the established poverty line.
Oh, okay. That sounds like an argument for shared parenting to me. You know, something many feminists are against. But shared parenting would give these mothers time to concentrate on work and their career. And once they have a job, it would help them get out of poverty. And need I also point out that yes, although many of these single mothers are in poverty, they are in fact also privileged, because there are many places in the world which do not have any form of social security net to help people like that. There are many places in the world which would not dream of giving someone a government handout. And in fact, throughout the vast majority of human history, such a thing would never happen. So the fact that these women are single mothers in a country which has welfare and other government handouts does in many ways make them privileged. But let's continue.
49% of women in Canada work outside the home. While most of them are not unionized, the possibility exists.
Okay, so remember this was written in 1981, and I'm guessing the number is much higher than 49% presently in Canada. As for most of them not being unionized, well, if you're going to make the argument that that's because of sexism, which is what they're clearly doing, then you need to give us the male comparison. For example, if only 15% of women were unionized and 90% of men, then maybe it's because of sexism, or maybe it's because men and women working in different industries. We would need to investigate. But there's the possibility that it might be sexism. Although I can't imagine why a union would turn down union fees from female workers. That really doesn't make a lot of sense to me. However, if it's say 15% women are unionised and 15% men, then you'd have a pretty hard time making the case that it's due to sexism. That would simply be a case that there's not enough unionism, or too much unionism if you hate unions, depending on your worldview. Or if it was, say, 15% women and 2% men, then once again, maybe it's because of men and women working in different industries, or maybe it's because of sexism. It's something that we'd need to investigate. But they only make this claim for women without any comparison to men, so we don't know what the actual situation is. And we see this a lot with feminists. They do it all the time. They do it in their articles written by feminist journalists, and I use that term very loosely because most of them aren't journalists, don't come close to being journalists, but they will constantly quote a figure for women but not give you the male comparison. And this is nearly always a dirty trick, like the number of native women which have gone missing in Canada. This apparently is a national crisis, yet they never tell you that a much higher percentage of native males have gone missing. So it's pretty hard to describe it as a female issue when you look at the full picture, which is why they only give you part of the picture. Like I said, it's nearly always a dirty trick, but let's continue.
51% of Canadian women still work inside the home. These women are often very isolated and have little or no access to organizing.
Well, that's definitely not the case anymore with the internet, but I don't think it was the case back in 1981 in any case. Are you suggesting that when a husband left to go to work, he would lock the door and lock the wife in, and she'd be chained to the kitchen sink and unable to communicate to the outside world or any other women? Not any neighbours or family members or friends or social groups or school groups that the children might go to? Apparently none of that ever happened apparently the poor women were chained to the kitchen sink and kept isolated from the rest of the world by their evil patriarchal husbands, right? Sure, I'm sure that happened in Canada in 1981. Happened all the time, right? Yep. Next.
Violence against women is a learned behavior.
Bullshit!
Now, if we're talking about perpetrators of domestic violence, be they female or male, then it is true, it is a learned behaviour in most cases, as Aaron Pizzi pointed out back in the 70s. If a child grows up with violent parents or a violent parent, either male or female, that child is far more likely to grow up and be violent themselves. Now, that doesn't mean every child that grows up in that situation will turn out that way, but some do, and they continue the cycle of violence. So in that sense, domestic violence is a learned thing. However, this group of second wavers have deliberately gendered it. Their argument is it is a learned thing, meaning something men learn or males learn to do specifically against women, not women against women or women against men or men against men, but only men against women. And I'm pretty sure they would argue it's not just in domestic violence situations. It's something society teaches all of men. Don't worry, I'm not going to play that bullshit clip again, but it's definitely what I'm thinking at this point. The truth is that men will go out of their way to save a stranger, particularly if that stranger is a female, and risk their life in doing so, and in some cases even die doing so. That's not the behaviour of a group which has been taught to hate the other group. Okay, white supremacists typically don't go out and save black people who are in danger of dying. That typically doesn't happen. But it's something men will do all the time. Yes, sure, there is a small percentage of men who are violent towards a small percentage of women, just as there is a small percentage of women who are violent towards a small percentage of men. And the vast majority of them have grown up in violent homes. That's what we need to be talking about, not generalizing all men as being taught to be violent towards all women. Now, I'm not entirely surprised that this group of second wavers would come to this conclusion, because they deal with women on a daily basis who have been the victims of male perpetrators. They don't see the other side. They don't see male victims of female perpetrators, so they're blind to that. And the fact that they're only seeing beaten women coming in who are victims of men has obviously skewered their worldview, although there's a fairly good argument that their worldview would have been skewed to begin with. But it's definitely reinforced it. But if you're a feminist separatist who rejects the entire world and sees it as a patriarchal prison, add to that an echo chamber where you only listen to things that reinforce your preconceived opinions, and then you have nothing but female victims coming in every day, it doesn't surprise me that you would see the world as nothing but male perpetrators and female victims. Not a very accurate view, though, is it?
It is an effective method of keeping women firmly in their places. If I hit you, you will do as I say. In this country, 54% of wives experience some degree of battering from their male partners.
Okay, so I find the term "some degree of battering" to be very, very suspicious. What exactly does some degree of battering mean? I suspect it's been made as broad as possible to include as many female victims as possible and inflate the statistics. I've seen this before with some feminists and domestic violence. I remember a few years ago there was a university that put up a page about domestic violence. It's since been taken down, but they included disagreeing with a woman as a form of domestic violence. Now, it's only domestic violence when a man does it to a woman. A woman can disagree with a man all she wants, because, that makes her a strong, independent woman, right? But if a man disagrees with a woman, that was classed, according to them, as domestic violence, as crazy as that sounds. Yes, I've seen stats inflated with bullshit like that in the past. So I am very suspicious about some degree of battering. If you throw a sock at someone, is that now considered some degree of battering? I don't know. Maybe yelling at someone. I don't know, because we don't have a definition of some degree of battering. But let's, for argument's sake, say that it's legitimate. Let's say that some degree of battering means, these people have actually been hit. They're telling us that's 54% of wives. Okay, what's the equivalent for men? Is it 2%? Is it 90%? Is it 50%? Because it's kind of relevant. If you're making the argument that men are violent exclusively towards women, then you need to tell us the number of battered men and the number of wives who are beating their husbands, so we can compare the two figures. If it's 54% of women and 53% of men, you got a hard time making the argument that violence is something done to women by men, right? However, if it's 54% women and 1% men, then that's a different story. You might actually have an argument, but you need to show us both figures, which feminists like this never do, mainly because it's fucking inconvenient, and they want to create the narrative that this is something exclusively happening to women. So, of course, I tried to find the source of these statistics, considering there's no citation, and I couldn't. Considering this article was written in 1981, I couldn't find the source for these stats. But I did find some stats in a report that was released in 2005 in Canada, and it looked at domestic violence from 1999 to 2004. So we have a good 5-year period of research.
Since the abuse of women cuts across all economic lines, even a woman who lives in Shaughnessy may be only one man away from welfare.
Okay, I find this claim to be somewhat amusing. In case you didn't figure it out by context, Shaughnessy is a very expensive upmarket part of Vancouver, where the wealthy live. So are you honestly trying to tell me that if a woman divorces her husband in Shaughnessy, she's not going to get half his stuff in divorce court? And possibly years of alimony? Really? She's going to be homeless, right? Sure. I'm sure that happens all the time. Those poor rich women in Shaughnessy, how do they survive?
There's a neat little catch about welfare. To get it, you have to have your own address. To have your own address, you have to have money, and if you don't have your own money, then you need welfare, which you can't get without an address of your own. Around and around it goes.
Wow. Without even realizing it, she just made an argument for the men's rights movement. Ironic, considering she thinks she's actually describing female oppression. And of course, these things would never happen to men, right? Well, the reality is that more men are affected by what she just said than women. The vast majority of those who sleep rough, who don't have a roof over their head, are in fact male. Now, there is a large population of female homeless as well, but they tend to get special services.
Some months ago, I did a piece on homelessness, which is overwhelmingly a male problem. A social worker wrote in to say, she emailed me to say that she works that she works with the homeless, and if a homeless woman comes to her on a Friday, she has to give her clothes, money, food, and accommodation. If a man comes in on a Friday, he's sent back out on the street with nothing. I mean, are we really surprised that today, for every woman who commits suicide, 3.5 men will?
Mike, we really need to talk about where you get these figures from. Okay,
they're all official. They're all government figures.
It is true
every one of
that
them.
more young.
To escape their oppression, to get away from the battering, women need concretes, a roof over their heads, an address to give MHR, Ministry of Human Resources, food for the children. This is where transition houses enter the picture and provide an essential link. What we are seeking to create is not just a safe shelter. There are no safe places, see atomic weapons.
No safe places because of atomic weapons. Well, yeah, I guess that's technically true, isn't it? And don't forget that evil patriarchy that's everywhere as well. It's the men. It's all the fault of the men.
A temporary retreat may help you to feel better, but it's not going to change the conditions out there. And there is where most of us have to live. What we are creating is an organizing center for women. Women will be able to support each other, educate each other with the stories of their lives, and move into action.
Okay, look, I think anyone who's been through trauma like that would benefit from talking about it with people who have also been through that trauma. However, there is a danger of it becoming an echo chamber. If you have a group of women who have been abused by men sitting around talking about how evil men are, then they might leave that situation thinking that all men are like that, especially if you're staying with an organisation run by radical second-wave feminists who blame everything on men and see men as the cause of all the world's woes. When you have that combination of things, it's more like indoctrination. It's more like brainwashing someone into a cult rather than something helpful.
Our office is already beginning to look like a transition house. On any given day you will find kids, dogs, telephones ringing, the typewriters flying and women, all kinds of women. But it's not enough just to hear stories. To end our oppression, we need to join together and fight back collectively. All women need the women's movement. Therefore, the movement must be accessible to all women.
We are the Borg. Lower your shields and surrender your ships. We will add your biological and technological distinctiveness to our own. Your culture will adapt to service us. Resistance is futile.
But it was a very unhappy time for me because she was very violent, and particularly to me. And I remember going to Moulton College to school, and she'd whipped me with an ironing cord. And I was standing in front of the teacher, and there she could see my legs were covered in welts and dried blood. And I said to her, "This is what my mother did to me. Will you help me?" And she said, "Well, no wonder you're such a dreadful child."
Oh, my goodness.
But that, you see, that was the problem in those days. Nobody ever admitted anything to do with domestic violence. And
Well, and I think it was in the 50s when doctors began to first suspect that children who came in with concussions and contusions and lacerations and broken bones, that it might not actually be the endless series of fake accidents that the parents pretended were occurring.
That's quite right. But the fact is that all stayed within the medical field. It never got out to the general public. So in a way, everybody knew, and all the agencies knew, but nobody did anything about it. Until in 1971, I had opened a little community centre for mothers and kids. The first woman came in and took off her jersey, and she was black and blue to the waist. And I took her home that night because I did know what she was talking about. And then, from then on, that was the first in the world of its kind. And from then on, women and children poured in. But I knew, and I was the only person, because there was no literature you could find about adult domestic violence. But of course, I was very open-minded because both my parents were violent. Both were equally dysfunctional. So as far as I was concerned, it was a family issue, it was a human issue. And so almost immediately after I opened the home for the mothers and kids, I opened one for men in North London, which I couldn't keep going because the millionaires who'd give me money for children and my mothers wouldn't give me a penny for men. And of course, that's true of 43 or so years later. It's still the same. There's virtually nothing in terms of refuge for men. But there needs to be.
This is something I've talked about at this show quite a bit, which is it's remarkable how little feedback occurs in the shows that I do where I talk about women's role in the cycle of violence. And it shocks me, and it still does deeply shock me, that society is unwilling to even discuss women's role in the cycle of violence. Somehow, it's like if you say, well, women are part of the cycle of violence, somehow people believe you're demonizing women and excusing men and so on, which I don't find to be the case at all. But it is remarkable the degree to which it's simply something which you can't talk about. And it seems to me that that's very much against the idea of equality for women, right? I mean, I was always sort of raised to say, well, treat women as equal to men. It's like, okay, well, then if they're committing crimes against children, which they are on a regular basis, not all, of course, then we should hold them accountable and work to find ways to deal with and remediate that issue. But boy, it's like this whole white knight phalanx comes up around blackened women's hearts to defend them from any moral responsibility, which I find is treating women like children.
Well, you have to go back to the beginning. And recently I wrote a book called This Way to the Revolution. It's the story of the setting up of the first shelter in the world, and then what happened subsequently. Now, for the first few years, I built a therapeutic community because I realized that where a parent can't parent because they too have been brought up in violence, there needs to be a therapeutic intervention. When you have a child that's come in, as an example, his father was a murderer. He murdered another child when he was 13. He strangled the child. And everybody was terrified of Peter except for me. And I talked to Peter. He'd been let out of prison. He'd been in prison since he was little. But when you know that his mother was a prostitute and beat him, she then abandoned him, and his father sodomized him regularly, which is why at 13 he was in the children's home. Who do we put in the dock? Where does it stop? That generational violence has probably gone on for 4 or 5 generations. I've always said what we need is family therapy, and indeed I changed the name from Women's Aid to Family Rescue.
Werden länger. Für kurz 2 Tage noch Munition, danach dann nur noch unsere Hände. Woher sie kommen, wohin sie gehen, darüber denken wir nicht nach. Ein neuer Anfang, ein altes Problem.